G'day everybody. I can see lots of faces online, many familiar faces and some new ones as well, and some other names that I recognise, but thank you all for joining us here. It's obviously harder to do these multicultural media conferences in person these days, and for this I think works pretty well, and hopefully it'll work for you. Now, I just wanted to say a few things up front, if that's okay, and then really hand it over to you for questions. I know some people have already indicated they want to ask questions, but others will have questions as well. We've got a bit of time set aside for it, but no doubt you're all busy and I've got things on as well, but we'll hopefully get through all of the issues you want to discuss. I suppose I wanted just to say a few things to you all as leaders of multicultural media. First up, just to alert you to the speech I did at the National Press Club last week, which was an important speech talking about our social cohesion and how we can maintain it. And I made the point that, you know, we have, I think, the most socially cohesive, harmonious, multicultural country on earth. And we want to obviously do everything that we can to maintain that. And it's particularly impressive, our social cohesion and unity, I think, given the huge diversity of the people that call Australia home. And it's not, we can't take it for granted though. And there's forces upon our social cohesion that weren't there 6 months ago in some cases and 10 years ago in others. And I outlined some of those forces in my speech. COVID itself is one of them, whereby we know it can have deleterious impacts in terms of pulling us apart from one another. And particularly it can have a negative impact on Asian Australians, through some of the discrimination and racism which they've had to face. And so that's just one of the forces that we haven't had to deal with in the past, challenging our social cohesion. But there's others as well, which I go through and point out. I then outline a few new initiatives which I really wanted to discuss and be able to address any questions in relation to, because I think that some of your readers and listeners will be particularly interested in our English language initiative particularly. And it was one of the things that I mentioned in my speech to say that obviously we are, we can all be more united together if there's a common language, and we want to support people whose English is poor to get them up to at least a basic level of English so that they can fully participate in our society, in our democracy, in our community, because the Australian way of life is that migrants come here and we put them in the centre of Australian life rather than on the fringes, and you can only be in the centre of Australian life if you can share the common language. And so to that end, we've changed the rules in relation to the eligibility for the Australian Migrant English Language Program. And effectively it means that anybody now whose English is poor can access free English classes for as long as they need. You might need more than 500 hours, and particularly if your native tongue is a language which is more linguistically distance from English, if you know what I mean by that. You may need 1,000 hours or potentially even more. That is now available to all Australians and residents to be able to undertake those classes. So I'd please encourage you to ensure that your readers are aware of it, so that everybody can take up that opportunity. And if they happen to have a little bit more time on their hands because of the COVID restrictions, this could be a great opportunity to take up some of these English language classes. So that was the first point I wanted to mention. The second point is that we are going to slightly update our citizenship test. As you know, the citizenship test is it's a multiple choice question of a series of randomly based questions from a long repository of questions, and we're particularly going to insert more questions which go to our liberal democratic values as opposed to key facts in relation to Australia. So that will come into place in November. We'll soon be putting out the new booklet and guide to be able to inform people of that. And I'll have more to say about that later this month in relation to that. But the types of questions, they won't be for anybody who's been in the country for a long period of time. They'll be very, in some respects, you may see them as quite straightforward questions around, might be something like if there's a, if there's a clash between a religious so-called law and a parliamentary law, which has greater, which trumps the other in Australian society, which of course we're a parliamentary system and that trumps all other laws, which everybody in Australia knows. But if you're coming from a system, or from a country which has a very different system in place, we just want to emphasise those types of things. Then the third thing I wanted to specifically mention to you was the announcement which I've just done today. And I particularly wanted to call this press conference for today after I'd done this announcement. And what I announced today was the formation of a new whole-of-government task force, which is deliberately set up to target businesses abroad and encourage them to our shores, and great super talented individuals abroad and encourage them to call Australia home. And this task force will be headed up by a senior business person called Peter Viwa, and it will have members of multiple different agencies in this task force, as well as linkages into the state governments. It will report to myself, who will chair a ministerial committee oversighting it. And we're excited about this opportunity, and we think that it's timely that we do this, given that Australia, I think, is even more well positioned to attract talent and to attract businesses because of the COVID pandemic. We're strategically well positioned in terms of how we've managed it from a health perspective compared to most other countries, from a social cohesion perspective, as I mentioned earlier, and even from an economic perspective, that even though we're in recession, our contraction is still significantly smaller compared to the contraction of many of our typical competitor countries, particularly such as the United States and the United Kingdom. So that was the last thing I wanted to mention. Or really the third thing I wanted to mention. The last thing really was, and I probably should have said this one up front, is, as I always do to when we get together, is just to say a very big thank you, and more broadly a thank you to the multicultural communities in Australia for the ongoing manner in which they've adhered to the COVID restrictions which are in place across the country, and particularly those in Victoria, my home state, which has very severe restrictions at the moment. And I see Fred Zhang nodding there, is very much familiar with it. So thank you for that, and an additional thanks to all of those multicultural community groups who again have gone beyond the call of duty and raised funds and reached out to their fellow Australians to support the overall efforts to care for those who are less fortunate. And we saw that during the bushfires, and we're seeing that again through the pandemic. And I think it's just a fantastic example of what Australia is all about, that no matter what your background is, no matter where you might be coming from, once you call Australia home, you chip in and help other Australians. And so I particularly thank you for those efforts as well. I might just leave it there in terms of my introductory comments, but I know we've got a number of questions. Steve, I think you're hosting this.
Yep.
A number of people I think have signalled already they want to ask questions, and there may be many more, and we'll just try to keep the questions short. I'll try to keep the answers really tight so that we can get through as many as possible.
Great, thanks, Minister. So the first question is from Mustafa at Dunya Newspaper. We got you there, Mustafa.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yes.
We can hear you, Mustafa. Just go ahead.
I think something is wrong. I can't hear you well. So
We might come back to you, Mustafa. Why don't we just
Sorry.
keep going, Steve, and we'll come back to Mustafa.
Internet.
Sure. So next up, we've got a question from Stephanie at Vision Times. I'll unmute you now.
If it's, can I pass the question? I can't hear you at the moment.
Sorry, Stephanie, you should be good.
Let's just go to Stephanie, and maybe Mustafa, in the meantime, can maybe, Jordan, you might be able to email Mustafa or message him and get him to actually write the question down or be able to deal with it. Stephanie.
Hello.
Stephanie, we got you. Yep, ask your question.
Yeah. So since the start of the COVID-19, so many people, especially the Asian Australians, they reported that they were suffering from the discrimination in our society. So I want to know, like, what efforts did the government do to deal with that problem?
It's a good question, and I think broadly we've done phenomenally well during this pandemic in terms of maintaining our social cohesion, and I think many of the multicultural communities have led the charge in terms of doing that and illustrating how much of a successful multicultural community we are. I think, unfortunately, there has been some quite high-profile incidences of disgraceful racism, which has occurred against Chinese Australians or even Asian Australians from others who have been, frankly, from other cowardly individuals. Now, I have called them out very publicly, as has the Prime Minister, and I've asked others to also call it out, and anybody who sees these types of acts should report them. If they've violence attached to them, should report them to the police. If they're general discriminatory behaviour, report it to the Human Rights Commission, who can deal with these types of things. But really, it's incumbent also upon all of us to call it out when we see it, because I think 99.9% of Australians are good, decent people, but there are that small, tiny percentage who, frankly, exhibiting behaviour which has no place in this country. I will just say briefly as well, we have had a small campaign in place through some of the ethnic newspapers and in some of the more prominent spots and the bus stops and some billboards and the like, simply pointing out that the Australian government is on your side and that racism has no place in this country, and providing details of where you can report it to.
Thanks, Minister. I've got Mustafa's question here, so I might just ask it on his behalf if we're still having audio issues there. So he was just asking about, in light of the speech last week at the Press Club and your references to foreign interference, what role do you see multicultural media playing in assisting government in those efforts?
Yeah, it's a good question, Mustafa. I pointed out that one of the newer forces which we haven't dealt with to the same extent for many decades, which has the ability to disrupt our society, is foreign interference. And there are some state actors, unfortunately, who will seek to divide us rather than unite us. Now, we've put in place laws to try to combat this, but the multicultural media can play a part, and All I would ask for from, I guess, any media outlet, be it a mainstream media outlet or a multicultural media outlet, is that you report factually and impartially and reflect as best you can the Australian government's position when we have policies to announce or which we have statements to make, but equally it's obviously up to you to get alternative views as well. I'd just ask for that careful, impartial, accurate reporting, which I know you can do well.
Okay, next question is from Raymond at Sameway Magazine.
Yes, Minister, I've got two questions. The Premier Eden Andrews on 13th of August announced a 40.3 million package to support multicultural communities, and in fact, in it, 5.5 million have been dedicated to distribution of information to core communities. The budget was echoed by Brett Sutton, the Chief Health Officer, on the needs that the multicultural community have been the most affected, infected communities. And Brett Sutton mentioned there's a lot of disinformation and misinformation from the home countries of these ethnic groups, and they did not get enough COVID-19 information. So how much will the federal government commit to distribute the COVID-19 information on the various policies concerned? The second question is about, we had proposed a COVID-19 multicultural information distribution mechanism to the minister, and it was replied at that time that it was not, we have done enough. But in view of the presentation with the minister, we consider setting up a mechanism to distribute COVID-19 information directly to the multicultural medias so that they can be more effective in distributing the information to multicultural Australians.
Two good questions there, Raymond. First up, I mean, I think you're from Melbourne, aren't you, Raymond? Yeah, no, I thought so. And you know, it's, as you know, the only serious place where we've got widespread infections is in Melbourne. And there's really only two reasons why we have widespread infections in Melbourne. One is that there was a failure in the quarantine system, and second is there's been an incapacity in the contract tracing system in Victoria. They're the two reasons. And in other states, there hasn't been the widespread infections throughout multicultural communities, despite them being as multicultural as Melbourne is, certainly Sydney is. So that's really the first point I wanted to say, Raymond. Second point is that you were right to point out that we did put additional resources into communicating in multiple different languages. In fact, all of our key fact sheets in relation to COVID-19 were translated into 63 different languages, and it's a very significant exercise. And there was something like 4,600 pieces of material which were distributed in that way. And every time we did this, Raymond, we would disseminate those fact sheets broadly through the something like 2,000, Jordan, I think that we've got 2,000 different community groups that we have on our databases. And we asked those community group leaders to forward those on and even put it on their own Facebook pages or WeChat groups or whatever, and distribute it that way as well. So that's an important point as well. And also some of our broader paid advertising campaigns as well, we've also ensured that they've been in multiple different languages, Raymond, too. Now, on top of that, we do need to make sure, I'm sure that many of these did go to multicultural media. We certainly place some ads in multicultural media, but we can ensure that we get your details, and then when we have key fact sheets that are translated into, you know, for you, Raymond, into Mandarin or Cantonese, whatever yours is in, that you can get those particular ones. So we can put that in place from now on if you'd like us to.
I think, Minister, the reality is, all right, there's some translated YouTube messages, but you can check their exposure, their read audience is about in low hundreds. And I think the fact that you mentioned stay in the computers, in the server, and you can check how many times of downloads that they're really distributed. And we got complaints from the community organization say, yes, some of the leaders receive information, as you said, but there's no way for them to distribute in the lockdown or to communicate digitally or other ways with the members. And and that is why in Victoria, 2 million have been dedicated to translation of material, but 5.5 million is dedicated to distribution. That is how to distribute the translated material to the users, to the community. That is big tackle.
No, right. And Raymond, it's a really good point. It's a challenge to get the information out to, and I'm just freezing here, I think. Is that freezing on me, Jordan? No, I can just see some people there freezing. The real challenge here is how we get information out to the broader public at large. And then on top of that, to particular different language groups if their English is not particularly strong. And as I said, we've gone to extraordinary efforts to do that. And I'd say that there's survey data now, and the Australian Bureau of Statistics just recently did this survey data, and it actually showed that called communities understood and acted in accordance with the COVID restrictions at a higher rate than the non-called communities. So clearly the message has been getting through, but is it getting through to everybody? And do we all collectively need to continue to make efforts? I think absolutely. And we need your support for that. And we need certainly community leaders' support for that as well.
All right, next up we've got Mary from Neos Cosmos.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi, Mary.
Hello. Okay, one of my questions is related to international students and visa holders who are experiencing problems at this time because they're not, employers are not hiring them because they're not entitled to JobKeeper allowances. So that's one question. And the other question refers to the announcement you made earlier regarding the task force that's going to target businesses from abroad. I'd like to find out when this will begin, what types of businesses will be targeted, but particularly when this will begin, when bearing in mind that businesses at the moment in Australia are languishing as well. So it's quite an exciting venture. I'd like to find out more about it.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. Let me deal with the second question first in relation to this task force. It's operational as from today and will be, can you hear me? Because I can see my screen freezing again, but that's all coming through. I can see Rosa. Can you head nod that my sound is coming through?
Yeah, we can hear you, Minister. Yep.
Okay. So that task force will start from today. It will target businesses predominantly in 3 areas, they being advanced manufacturing, financial services and health. And initially we'll focus on 3 or 4 countries within that. And that will be the United States, United Kingdom, Hong Kong and Singapore. And our objective is to attract some of these businesses to Australia, primarily because by doing so, you generate jobs for Australians. You know, if you get a business which comes over here, invests, that creates jobs. And that's the same, Mary, as well with this, what I call the global super talent. These are the real job-making migrants that we want to attract. They might be the entrepreneur, the serious investor, the tech wizard that everybody's chasing to get them to work for their firm. And we want to make it attractive for them to come to Australia. And again, that actually helps in terms of supporting our economic growth and job creation in Australia. Very briefly on international students, I appreciate what you say, Mary, and I know you've raised this point before. We've provided assistance to international students in the form of allowing them to access their superannuation. We've boosted the what's it called, the emergency relief budget by $7 or $8 million, and provided flexibility on their visas, so they have opportunities to work even more hours in some cases, particularly in, say, the supermarkets, which were really struggling, out on the farms, in aged care and some of the health occupations, etc., to provide those opportunities. But I do know that, some of them are struggling still as well, and we ask those that are to call on their family support and equally call on the universities themselves, who have provisions also to support their international students.
Thanks. Next up, we'll go to Bang from ABC China. Oh, sorry, Bang, I'll just unmute you again. I'll unmute you in a second.
Yeah. Hi, Minister. Thanks for having me here.
Thanks,
as you just mentioned, that Australia is well positioned to attract business talents and opportunities from overseas. With the context of many super talents from Hong Kong are eyeing off Australia as their future home after the national security law. What are the benefits Australia is going to offer them exactly? And if the state government will actually involve in the discussion to tailor the strategy to support this program specifically. And my second question is that, while Australians are very proud of us as a multicultural country, during an investigation done by the Ecbc since 2018, we found so many international students and backpackers experienced exploitation in the past when they were actually working for migrant businesses across the country. Some of them may just, being paid for $5 an hour. Especially during the pandemic, it's a crisis for everybody. And I'm just wondering if the government has concerns about their livelihood and what exactly we can do to protect their rights at the moment and after the pandemic. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Let me deal with your second question first, which is migrant exploitation. That's unacceptable and unlawful in Australia for anybody, be it a migrant, be it an Australian citizen, a permanent resident, a visa holder, you name it. It is unlawful for an employer to underpay that individual. Everybody is governed by the Fair Work Act, and we've in fact increased the penalties associated with worker exploitation. So please be assured that we take this seriously. We've boosted the resources for the Fair Work Commission to be able to take that seriously, and please report it if you're aware of it. Second, the first question was in relation to Hong Kong and how do we make it attractive? What are we offering? Specifically for Hong Kong residents, we've done a couple of things. We've offered for students a 5-year graduate visa if you come and study here from Hong Kong, and with a pathway to permanent residency afterwards. And the same thing with the skilled visas, which are typically, as you know, they're either a 2 or a 4-year skilled visa, for the employer-sponsored skilled visa, sorry. And we've made those into a 5-year skilled visa for Hong Kong residents, or Hong Kong residents, and with a pathway to permanent residency at the end of that as well. And we think both of those things will be attractive. In fact, we know that we've already had applications from Hong Kong residents for those things. On top of that, I just think that there will be, and that's on the talent side, and on the business side, we know because some companies which have their regional headquarters in Hong Kong have already publicly indicated that they want to move their regional headquarters with the national security law coming into place in Hong Kong. And they want to move to a place which is more democratic, as the rule of law in place is more similar to the type of system that they've been used to having for the last 30, 40, 50 years in Hong Kong. And we want to be in the position to, to attract some of those businesses to Australia. And we want to make attractive packages to attract them, so that instead of them maybe going to a Singapore or a Tokyo, they'll come to Sydney. And hopefully Melbourne will be open again one day and they can come to Melbourne.
What exactly our package is like in terms of tax reducing or any specific strategies that we can actually offer them with a detailed plan, anything like that in discussion yet?
Yes, we haven't got to that yet, Bang, and it'll be customised company by company, because different companies are seeking different things. Some companies want to be assured that they can get all their critical staff in. Some companies want to be assured that there's a skilled workforce back in Australia, or that they can get the proper planning and red tape approvals back here. There's others that will be looking for some financial incentives. And what this task force does, and the strength of it, is that it puts all of our tools that we have across the Commonwealth Government and indeed across the state governments in the one toolbox, so that then when we approach the company, we can say, all right, well, if you need visas for your critical staff, we can do that. And we'll sort out your planning laws. We'll make sure that we link you up to training systems. We can get you an R&D incentive. We can discuss whether or not you need other tax incentives, all in the one discussion. We've never had that before, a real Team Australia approach, if you like. And we think this could be quite powerful and give us the best opportunity to attract some of those businesses who we know will be looking elsewhere to set up. And we want at least some of those to consider Australia.
Thank you, Minister. Appreciate it.
Next up, we'll go to Avneet at SBS.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, hi, Avneet. Nice to see you.
Hi. So my question is regarding the international borders. You've kind of spoken a lot about it. You've also spoken about the task force that's set up, and sadly India is left out of it. But my question is, there's a lot of increased push from business lobbying groups, from the economists, from business leaders to open the international borders. And they're saying it might hamper the economy. Some of them are also saying that it might have an impact on Australia's response to the pandemic and its post-pandemic recovery. What do you have to say about it? Do you think now that Victoria is kind of sort of controlling the pandemic, has been able to contain the second wave of infections, do you think we can expect some relaxations as far as international borders are concerned?
Good question. The first point I'd say is that the task force, its initial set of countries does not include India, but that does not exclude India either, Avneet. I just wanted to make that point. We'll still be opportunistic if there's some great talent and some great businesses that want to come to Australia from India. I think that, obviously Victoria, the second wave of infection in Victoria has changed the situation markedly for the country. And I think it's made everybody, you can see that we've got all of these state border closures now, and in part because everyone's nervous about Victoria. And it probably means it's slowed down our path to being able to reopen international borders. Previously we had foreshadowed that we might have some trials of international students by now. That we may have been able to have that bubble that we're talking about with New Zealand, a travel bubble, open by now, but that hasn't happened. Now, it's very difficult to predict when we can reopen the borders properly again, Avneet. Obviously, if there's a vaccine which is developed and which becomes globally available, that will be the game changer, and hopefully we can start to get back to somewhere close to normal again. Until that time, we'll have to be very careful and very deliberate in terms of how we reopen. But our nation has been built on immigration. Immigration's been so central to our economic success, to our social success, to our cultural success, that we do need to get to being an immigrant nation again. But the pace of going from here to that point is still pretty hard to predict. And we're thinking through this really carefully, even in terms of when we do open, who are our priority groups that will allow in. Obviously some of this global super talent will be some of those priority groups, but are there other priority groups that really aid in our economic recovery, particularly, that we're thinking through?
Okay, next up we'll go to Niraj from the South Asia Times.
Hi, Alan. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Alan, you addressed the National Press Club on 28th of last month. Yeah. And in that you talked of foreign interference and foreign countries influencing the multicultural communities, which I understand, as I was talking to a few people around, people think about China. So is it just China, or it could be any country?
My speech in relation to that section, and whenever the government talks about foreign interference, we never refer to individual countries, and the laws aren't targeted at any individual country. They are targeted against all foreign interference, and there are multiple state actors who seek to interfere in Australian society. So the point that I was making in that speech was foreign interference comes in many forms and is at a very serious level in Australia at the moment, the highest since World War II, according to the head of ASIO. And one of the impacts of the foreign interference can be to divide our communities. And we certainly want to do everything that we can to prevent that division occurring. And that was the point that I was particularly making. And I was particularly concerned with how multicultural communities can be, there can be objectives to divide our multicultural communities from some foreign state actors. And we want to protect our community from that, because our success is based on a united multicultural society, which we are renowned around the world for, and we want to maintain that. And so consequently, it's incumbent upon all of us to make efforts, but particularly for the government to lead in this regard.
Thanks, Minister. Next we'll go to Moziki at SBS.
Hi, Minister. This is Mosiki. I work with SBS Hindi. I have 3 questions today. My first is, does government have any timeline on when will the temporary visa holders be allowed to come back to Australia? My second question is, what is lacking in the current Australian value statement that the government hopes to include when you update the value statement? And my third question is there a plan to include English language test as part of citizenship processing?
The answer to the third question is no. We won't be changing the Citizenship Act in relation to that and putting in place new English language requirements. The Citizenship Test itself is in English, as you'd be aware, but other than that, there isn't a requirement. The answer to the first question in relation to temporary migrants, when will they be able to come back in? They're coming back in small numbers already, and we have started processing some temporary migrant applications again. And just a few days ago, I announced a new priority skills shortage list, which consisted of 17 occupations. And so they will be prioritised first, and they'll have exemptions automatically at the borders as well to be able to come in. And then your second question, which has now escaped me.
All right, I'm happy to repeat it. What is lacking in
the value statement? The value statement.
That's right. Yeah.
Sorry about that. And then your second question about the value statement. Listen, it will be some minor changes to language, to be honest, rather than wholesale changes. I think you'll see them as being quite sensible and just making sure that we're updating the language, that it's clear language, understood, and very consistent with our modern democratic value-based system.
Thanks. Next up, we'll go to Fred at Melbourne today. If you're still with us, Fred.
Sorry, Steve, I just saw Maziki just had a quick follow-up question. I don't know if she wanted to.
Yes, all I was asking was that, there are certain words which are used in the Australian value statement. Do you want to emphasize on certain aspects of the value statement that you think will be updated?
You'll see this in due course. They won't be radical changes, Maziki. It'll be very similar sentiment, but just some slight language changes just to make it the language clearer, more concise, more easily understood. It's a very important statement that we ask everybody who comes into the country to sign, and we just want to emphasise this even more, that there's these core values which unite us. Because, I said this in my social cohesion speech at the press club, that ultimately the key thing that unites us all is our liberal democratic values, and we have to defend those. We have to constantly educate people about them, and we want people to deeply understand them. And so it's just an element of that objective is to update that value statement.
Thank you.
Fred, we might come to you. Got a bit of background noise there.
Hear me?
Yep, Fred, we got you now.
Yeah, and thanks for having me here, Alan. It's nice to see you again.
Good to see you, Fred.
Yeah, I got two questions. The first one is, according to our speech, the government would recruit more community liaison officers to build up a network to enhance the government's engagement with the community from grassroots. Can you tell me about this position? Because I believe most of the Chinese community members is the first time for them to hear this position.
Yeah, so we've had this community network in place for 2 or 3 years now. It was actually, to be honest, it was something that I put in place last time I was Multicultural Affairs Minister, thinking that we did not have sufficient capability within the Immigration Department at the officials level to be having that ongoing engagement with the multicultural communities. So we would have, how many do we have, Jordan, at the moment? 20 already, 29 community engagement officers now across the country, whose job actually is to stay as closely connected as possible with the various different community groups in their respective city. And I think that's been tremendously successful. And what that's enabled is, even during this year, throughout the bushfires and the pandemic, they've been able to have hundreds, if not thousands, of engagements with community leaders and community groups to hear one-on-one what the issues are, to communicate our message, but more importantly, to understand, are there things that we can do better? Give us that feedback. Now, we're just going to boost that by adding, in some respects, just language skills to the mix. And we've identified 4 that we really want to boost, and they're largely some of the 4 larger communities, to be honest, whose English can be poorer, and so having those native language skills will be beneficial. And they've been Mandarin, Cantonese, Vietnamese, and Arabic. So we'll recruit people, and the ads are already out, so if you know good people that want to apply, please point them in that direction. But we'll recruit 8 or 10 good people that can enhance those efforts. They're really important roles. So if you do know people, then point them our way.
Yeah, and my second question is, Australian citizen Lei Chen has been detained by the Chinese authority recently, and she still has 2 kids in Melbourne. How's her situation now, and why she's being detained, and how is the federal government going to aid Ms. Chen and bring her back to Australia?
This is the journalist, the Australian journalist in China. Yeah. To be honest, I'm not best placed to answer that question, Fred. The Foreign Minister is better placed to be able to address that. We can get you her statements on that. I don't know if she's been out today speak to the media. I think she was yesterday, though. And if you haven't got the transcription from her press statement yesterday, we can get it for you, Fred.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, now we'll go to Ashok Kumar from the Indian Subcontinent Times. Have you got us? Ashok, can you hear us? No, it looks like we've lost him. Next up, we'll go to Ravi. Just let me unmute you, Ravi.
Can you hear me, Alan?
Yes. G'day, Ravi.
Fine. How are you?
Yeah, good, thank you.
Thanks. Thank you for your Scott Morrison team and your team working very well for looking after us, Victoria, at this challenging moment. And my two question is social cohesion for very important for human being. And the Victorian government, especially Minister for Multicultural Affairs, Victoria, failed her duty of care to support people from all ethnic backgrounds. Recent email sent to you in an example for how ethnic community feels social isolation and mental depression. And my second question is the brutal cost of travel bans. I am not comfortable with it. Are you?
I didn't quite get that.
My second question?
Yeah, I didn't hear the second question there, Ravi. It's your audio broke up for me.
Can I repeat the question? First question?
Yeah, just repeat the question, Ravi.
Yeah, just briefly, Ravi. Just keep it short if you could, please.
Yes. See, the social cohesion for very important for human being, and Victoria government, especially Minister for Multicultural Affairs, Victoria, failed her duty of care to support people from all ethnic backgrounds. Recent email sent to you is an example for how ethnic community feel social isolation and mental depression. That is my first question. Second question, this is the brutal cost of Australia's travel ban. I am not comfortable with it. Are you?
Yeah, they're two good questions. They're certainly in relation to the mental health issue. I mean, this isn't just within multicultural communities, it's across the nation and certainly across Victoria. I mean, it's deeply depressing what's happening in Victoria at the moment. I get correspondence every single day in relation to people's concerns about the economic situation, about their mental health, about their inability to see their loved ones, their grandmother who lives by herself. And so we just have to hope that we can get out of these restrictions sooner rather than later, and we can only really do that if we get the infection rate obviously under control again. We've put in a lot of additional funds for mental health, including for the Multicultural Mental Health Foundation. And we know there's been significant demand on those organisations that we have funded, the Headspaces, the Lifelines, Beyond Blues and the like. And we'll need to keep a close eye on that. And if they need more support, I'm sure that we'll be there to provide that. In relation to what was the second point on? Sorry, I just lost my train of thought, Ravi, in terms of your second point.
Travel ban.
The travel ban, yes, of course. I should have just written it down. But in relation to the travel ban, I know this concerns people, and it's to do in part with, it goes back to quarantine arrangements, which are managed by the state governments. And because of the failures in quarantining in Victoria, all of the other states and territories have become nervous about their quarantining arrangements, and so have shrunk the number of beds which they effectively have available for it. Now, that means that, there's still 23,000 Australians who are seeking to come back into the country, let alone if there's, that many Australians, again, exiting the country, then wanting to come back in and placing further pressure on those quarantine beds. So I understand the frustration which people have in relation to this. You can apply for an exemption on compassionate grounds, and there are thousands of people who are granted those exemptions, but at the moment it still is at the exemption level, Ravi, I'm afraid.
Thanks, Minister. The last one we've got will be from Rajesh Sharma.
Thank you, Minister, for the. I have two questions. Usually, there are 160,000 places available every year for migration. Last year, we did 35,000 to apply. Is there a number this year, financial year? And the second question is, I'm happy that you're looking at business migrants to set up big factories and other giving employment to the local people. But looking at Adani Group, the ease of doing business in Australia, it's not very, everyone knows what Adani went through. So will these business migrants will have a smooth run and not the run what Adani had?
So first up on the migration rate itself, you've confused two different numbers. One is the permanent migration cap, which is 160,000, and last financial year came in at about 135,000 in terms of permanent migration cap. Now, a lot of those permanent migrants are made permanent migrants from Australia because they're an international student. They were on a temporary skilled visa already here, and maybe half become permanent migrants coming straight into the country. The 35,000 figure is what's called the net overseas migration rate, which is a sort of the net effect of those people coming into the country minus those people exiting the country. And that's been actually sitting on over 230,000 per year for some time now. And last financial year, you're right, did come in from memory at about 35,000. And this financial year is forecast to be, also very low. Now, Treasury have done some estimates, and they have us rebounding, if you like, with our net overseas migration quite rapidly in the year after. But there's a lot of assumptions in their estimates, and I'm not certain that those assumptions will play out accurately. So in relation to the ease of doing business, I think you're right. That is something that we need to just generally work on as a nation. It's something which we are working on as a nation. One of the things which Adani came across, and many of the large-scale businesses have come across, has been what's called the Ecbc Act, which is the environmental approvals process, which takes years and years, and in some respects is duplicated at a state level as well. And large projects get caught up and don't go ahead, and consequently we don't get the jobs. So we're reviewing that. We've actually got a bill in the parliament at the moment to streamline those environmental approvals processes without diminishing the environmental standards as such. And that's the objective there, as it is across the board in terms of getting approvals processes through. All the states and territories have an interest in this as well. And they've actually been very cooperative in terms of working with each of the respective ministers. In my responsibility, I've been working with some of the planning ministers, environment minister, etc., to see if we could make doing business and getting investments up and running more simple so that we get more jobs. Because ultimately, that is the big challenge for all of us, is to get those jobs back. Because we've got unemployment, which will be an effective rate of 13%, a figure that we have not seen for many decades. And it's going to have very, very serious consequences for our society. So that's our big task, is get the jobs back and while maintaining our cohesion. So I think I'll leave it there, Steve. I think we've got through everybody who's wanted to ask questions. Yep. Thanks for your patience. I know it's been a lengthy discussion on almost an hour.